First off, I'd like to introduce, I'm not sure that you need any introduction, Narayanan Vaidyanathan from the ACCA. He heads up the Business Insights group there, a number of different specialists that are working on things exactly within the topic area that we are also interested in, so various emerging technologies, as well as human-centered technologies, because that's at the core of what everything ultimately gets back to. But particularly on the tech side, AI, blockchain, digital ethics, emotional intelligence, that role within the digital world and so on. And Narayanan has very kindly offered to present to our group today, particularly around the AI ESG area. There was a paper, a pre-release paper, it should be noted, that Narayanan kindly forwarded to the group for us to take a look at in advance, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it. So Narayanan, why don't I pass over to you and give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Brian, and hello everyone. I'm really delighted actually to be here joining all of you in this discussion, and I think I'd like to start first of all by also extending my thanks, really heartfelt thanks to IASBA and to this group, and to Brian and Cam in particular, who've really helped direct some of our thinking as well as at ACCA in terms of how we wanted to approach this particular piece of work. We, as Brian was mentioning, I work within a central policy team based in London, and within my immediate team, so I look a lot at emerging technology, but within my immediate team, there are 3 other policy specialists. One of them is an economist, which is probably less relevant to today's discussion. The second looks at the global public sector, which is also perhaps less relevant, but the third person who we've just finalized the hiring on is a sustainability expert. So while today's discussion is from the emerging markets, from the emerging technology point of view, and I'm looking at the intersection of emerging tech and ESG, there's also going to be a person joining my team who's an out and out pure ESG specialist as well. So they may be, to the extent that IASBA also wants to look at broader issues outside, that may also be, but which are ESG orientated, that may also be something to just bear in mind. As I said, I did really want to thank and acknowledge the support from IASBA in terms of our approach to this piece of work, simply because what we've realized in this space is that it's constantly moving, it's constantly evolving. And one of the challenges that we've had is to try and get to something which we feel has a certain amount of longevity, relevancy, and shelf life, so that it takes time for us to disseminate messages across our global audience. We have tens of thousands of members across the world. And they're in countries which are at very different levels of technological advancement. And we're trying to bring everybody along into a common understanding. I'm pleased to say that, this particular report has attracted, a good amount of participation and traction, both in terms of providing inputs, because we find that our members and our partner organization, I should add, this is a co-branded report between us and CAANZ, Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand. And I'm pleased to say that we've had good traction from over 5,700 members across both our organizations, members and students, I should add, across both our organizations participating in the survey. But I think equally importantly, now that the report is going to be out later this week, I'm pleased to say that it's also something that organizationally is we'll be seeking to increase awareness about this kind of area. As I'm sure you're probably aware, in October we've got Global Ethics Day coming up, and so ACCA and CANZ will be jointly using this report to do a kind of a global dissemination and member outreach. So we're hoping that we'll be really kickstarting that process of building the conversation. So hopefully that gives a little bit of perspective. What I might do now, if that's okay with everybody, is I'm going to switch off my video and be on voice only. And I will also try and share my slides so that hopefully then we can proceed into using that as the basis for the comments that follow. I'd be grateful if someone could tell me whether you're able to see my screen, whether the slides are actually sharing.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, they are.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. So why don't we kick on from here? So essentially, the title that we have here, Ethical AI for Sustainable Adoption, is really reflective of the fact that we're trying to square a few different areas here. We're looking at AI, we're looking at ethics, and we're looking at ESG. So there are three different things that we're trying to work across in this piece of work, which has been, a challenging thing to bring together in a coherent way. But we think that, the world is interdisciplinary, life is interdisciplinary, and our thought leadership needs to reflect that as well. This report, is hasn't come in isolation. We've commented in the past on AI. So you see two product-orientated reports there. That first one is machine learning, more science than fiction. It's kind of an introduction to AI for professional accountants. And then explainable AI kind of links a bit more to the ethics agenda, actually, because it's talking about interpretability and explainability of AI more specifically. Then we've got a piece of work which we did with EY last year, which is called Meaningful Work for the Digital Professional. And there we're looking at it more from a jobs and career point of view, not just AI, that's a wider digital piece. But I've just highlighted one finding within that report, which says, we asked across 10 families of technologies, what is your current usage? And the red box there is AI. And currently AI is about 12% of people said we're using AI. And we also asked them, by the end of this 2020s decade, where do you think you're going to be on AI? And that was 86%. So from kind of 1 in 10 to 9 in 10 is the story. And even accounting for the fact that people are very optimistic about the future, even if you discount for that, is still an order of magnitude difference. So I think what we're saying here is that AI is kind of moving from the lab experiment to much more mainstreaming over this decade of the 2020s. And as that happens, ethics is going to become more important because it's going to be something which is much more real. It's not just an experiment that a few people are playing around with. We also commented a lot on ethics. Ethics and Trust in a Digital Age was a report a few years ago that we, in fact, also worked with IESPA at the time on. And then more recently, last year, we did a little paper called Ethics in a COVID-19 World, which wasn't technology specific, but really it overlapped a bit, but looking more at how COVID is kind of, what the experiences of our members are. Just one final piece there, which is on coding, which is looking at, a paper on coding and why, as a professional accountant, it might have some relevance to what they need to consider. As an organization, ACC is not recommending that all accountants need to code, but the paper is really demystifying it and showing that there are certain aspects of it where it can be a valuable thing that certain professionals can bring to the mix. So that's kind of the context for this report. In terms of the methodology of this report, there are really three primary sources in addition to the usual desk research. One is the global survey that I referred to, which is about 5,700 respondents. The second is an online discussion group. So what we kind of realized is that ethics is qualitative. It's not just about numbers and survey data. So over a period of 5 days, we ran an online discussion group with 42 people from across the world who expressed an interest and who have an involvement in this area. They're essentially drawn from kind of ACCA's stakeholder base. And we picked up quite a few qualitative comments, which we've peppered through the output as well, because we found that quite helpful for our own understanding as well. And then, of course, thirdly, there were some expert interviews. These are about 20 people who are kind of deep experts in this space, and we use that, and they're listed in the acknowledgements of the report if that's of interest, if you want to know. So this is a little bit of a quick one-pager, the kind of the summary of the survey side of it on a page, if you like. And the way I think about it, we have survey data across different parts of the world. So I think it gives an opportunity for our stakeholders around the world to get a bit of a sense of what their region looks like or their country looks like on this kind of one pager. This is the global version. And I think, we'll talk about it a little bit more as I do a quick run through the report itself. But I think that some of the things that caught our eye were first of all, the importance. We started at the top with this notion of, I agree that leaders in my organization prioritize ethics as highly as generating profits, because we felt very strongly that there's the headline bit isn't about AI. It's not about technology. It's just a wider piece about where is ethics in your reference frame. And we felt very strongly that we have to start with that starting point. Um, you know, 2 and 3 is it's I think in a world which is trying to move towards purpose-driven organizations, I think we would have hoped for a slightly higher number, but that's why it's research. It's not marketing. It is what it is, and that's what the numbers are. We talked a little bit about living with these 3 dimensions: living with AI, using AI, and governing AI. And we've just given that information on a page here. I'm not going to get into it now because I'll talk about it very quickly as we go through the report itself. I did mention Global Ethics Day will be showcasing this report as part of ACCA's outreach to our global stakeholder base, and also at our what we call the Accounting for the Future virtual conference, which is later in the year, and that's our biggest annual conference. So this report will have a session in that, and we normally expect in the tens of thousands of our members and stakeholders listening in on those, watching those webinars and things. So hopefully there'll be a good avenue to disseminate what we are learning as well. And as I said, I mean, fundamentally, the report is looking at these 3 dimensions of ES and G, and really trying to see, how does that correlate with, some of the fundamental principles, with all of the fundamental principles that IASBA has set out, and trying to make some of those connections as we go through it. And at the end, we also sort of try and think about, how effectively this chart also translates into kind of things that our members can think about in terms of things they need to do in their organizations. They might not always think directly in terms of fundamental principles, but they have this lens, and then they have, I guess, the executive summary lens, which is a bit more how they can try and respond to some of the findings. So with that preamble in mind, what I thought I'll do now is just take some of those things that I talked about and across the ES and G dimension, and reflect a little bit on what we're seeing here. You might have had the opportunity to go through some of this in the report, so I hope I'm not repeating myself too much, but hopefully it'll still be of some value to hear it as I go through it here. I think the starting point for us was really just to do a reality check on AI adoption. So where are we? What is actually the picture on the ground on that? And as I said, last year we did that piece with EY, which came out at 12%, and this sort of breaks that down, and it's remarkable. It's thankfully fairly consistent, I think, with what we saw there, although it's broken down a bit more. And so we're seeing roughly between 7 and 19%, depending on the use case. And I think the bottom line here is, there's a well understood narrative around data explosion. But I think the important thing here is a lot of that data explosion, which is currently happening and which is going to happen, is unstructured data. So this is Word documents, PDFs, emails, scans, pictures, handwritten notes, video, audio, social media stuff. So it's the unstructured stuff that is really makes AI as important as it is, because it's uniquely good at dealing with that kind of information, which you can't put in a row and in a column in the way that you would in a relational, Excel or a database type environment. And I think it has implications because historical investments have tended to be in infrastructure that can handle structured data, and future needs are going to be very much around unstructured data. And I think that effectively sets the ground for the realization that AI is going to explode, simply because the amount of unstructured data is going to explode. And we spoke to IBM in the course of this piece of work. And by the way, ODG participant, if you're wondering, is the online discussion group participant. So we've just peppered a few of these comments that came through in that as we go along. But as I was saying, the explosion in unstructured data, we think, is one of the big drivers, which is going to push a huge amount of AI take up in this decade. And that means that there is going to be an energy consumption. There's going to be electricity consumption. AI has an initial setup, which is the training phase, but there's also the so-called inference phase where you have to use it and maintain it, and it keeps learning as it goes along, the machine learning aspect of it, all of which means that there's a non-trivial maintenance load as well. And so on the one hand, you've got the data that is available for use exploding. On the other hand, you've also got the processing power to deal with that data exploding. And there are estimates which say it's growing exponentially, every 3 or 4 months, much faster than Moore's law, which was the kind of perceived traditional wisdom of how fast computing power increases. And you've also got miniaturization. A lot of this extra computing power is getting squashed into smaller and smaller chips, and basically that creates heat, and you need energy to cool it, and you've got cooling systems and data centers running all of this, which is powering this computation and the cooling systems around it. You've got toxic materials and rare earth materials that are needed for this cooling. So there's a lot of stuff in the background. Now at the front end, the professional accountant is not going to see all of this, but all of this is happening. And if you look at one of the things that came up in the work we did, this natural language processing model, there was an estimate that a single model like that can use up the equivalent of 125 round trips between New York and Beijing in terms of the energy consumption. So it's not a trivial amount. And really, where we see the professional accountant is in the procurement side. So really understanding if your vendor is thinking about these things, they have a responsible approach towards AI. I talked in my earlier beginning comments about coding. And one of the things we talk in that paper is this idea of clean code, because you can do things in a really messy, inefficient way and achieve outcomes which end up using a lot more energy. So, there, and I'll come on to the vendor side later on as well, but this is just an initial taster of that, which is, there's something there around thinking about what are the questions you're asking the vendors you're dealing with, or do they represent their green credentials in some way? Are they even thinking about it at all? I think on a more kind of direct note, AI can also be part of the solution. And, there's, all of you will be aware, there's a big environmental conference happening later in Glasgow called COP26. There's a huge push by different countries. It's a very high profile thing where different countries are setting out net zero targets and saying that by this date, by 2030 or 2050, we're going to have net zero carbon emissions, and we're going to be much more green. And at the next level down, organizations are latching onto that as well. And there's a huge incentive for organizations to say, you know what, we are doing the right thing. We are making our own pledge to say that we're going to be net zero, hit our net zero targets as well, like everybody else. And so there's a huge pressure, both geopolitically and governmentally, and also to put it bluntly, from a marketing point of view, for organizations to make sure that they're part of the narrative in this space and they don't seem out of touch. Now, that's great, and AI can be a part of the solution here, because one of the problems that we are increasingly hearing about and seeing is this area of greenwashing, where there's a lot of pressure on companies to present themselves in a certain way, and they're not actually always doing everything in the background to support what they say they do in terms of their green credentials. And one of the advantages with AI is that it can use things like natural language processing. ESG data is fundamentally unstructured data. So it's not financial numbers. It's often, a lot of the insight is in the narrative. It's in things like company reports, regulatory filings, social media news, voluntary initiatives, things that, are relevant to being in line with what the SDGs want, or the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures, TCFD, is looking for. So a lot of the things is about trawling through this sort of information to understand what is actually happening. And that here is an example of a tool. This is a company called Data Moran, and basically they look at this idea of double materiality is obviously not their concept, but they're taking this concept and using AI to really understand what's happening in industries across both dimensions. And you can see that their software is able to trawl across entire industries and see, which kind of concepts. So they have a very, very sophisticated taxonomy basically across, and you could see some examples there in that table, where they break down, this whole space of ESG into material risks and material opportunities, and those are defined through very granular level, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, various levels of granularity in the concepts. And once with those concepts, which is their IP essentially, they're able to then analyze industries and say, what is this industry, and a particular concept, where does it rate on financial materiality, where does it rate on impact materiality, and are there things that need to be done more in terms of what the industry is actually doing beyond just issuing a press statement saying something. What are they actually doing? So these kind of tools are starting to now get under the surface of it. And from an ethics, and from time to time I've also signposted some of the kind of ethics dimensions that I showed in that very first table at the start of the presentation. So we see things like objectivity coming into play, for example. We see, in terms of that green claims versus green performance, because there's a potential here for management pressure to say, actually, we need to be seen to be saying, and we need to be seen to say certain things. And, AI can actually help with really sense checking and seeing if that is actually grounded in some truth. I think in terms of the societal side of it, we looked at a few different dimensions. So that when we were talking about AI and society, with the chart there, I've picked that out because I think it really demonstrates the kind of, there are a few levels of complexity in this. On the one hand, there's a view that it is something which quite a few people feel that it is something which will eventually raise, or is raising, overall standard of living. But equally, when you ask about level of inequality, then it's a much more cautious picture. It's a much more kind of less effusive, less positive picture. And I think that really speaks to the fact that there is a certain tone of caution, a tone of, I would say, even nervousness to a degree around where this is going to go, and what potential it has to increase existing inequalities that exist within our society. And I think from an ethics point of view, again, there's a very important public interest obligation here, particularly to underrepresented or to vulnerable groups, because this has the potential to be a really powerful technology. It's not a single-use technology. I mean, to quote the cliche, it's a bit like electricity from 100 years ago, right? If they had thought about it as a single technology, they'd be completely missing the point of how much it's totally embedded into the way we live our lives. And AI is expected to be along those lines. So public interest and being able to deploy it in a way that takes care of the less powerful in society, or who don't have a voice in the same way, will become part of the discussion. And you can see there's some, we see on the one hand, one participant talking about how in their country, they feel that it could really help with tax evasion, while somebody else is a lot more concerned about, how their rights as a citizen could be affected by the way they don't know what's being done with their information. And I think as we come out of COVID-19, and as different countries emerge from this pandemic and the crisis that it's brought in at different speeds, this whole space of inequality will be one that at a macro level will be something that will be really important to keep an eye on. I think it's also worth saying that even at an individual level, at a more tactical level, there are public interest considerations. So things like people not realizing that they're contributing to a machine learning algorithm, for example. So there's this idea of participation washing, for example. So if any of you have gone on the internet and you've used things like reCAPTCHA, which is used to sign stuff, or not to sign stuff, to check that you're a human being and that you're not a bot. So it's sometimes called CAPTCHA, sometimes called reCAPTCHA, and it makes you, for example, look at a series of images and select certain images within that. Now, what you're doing is you're kind of ensuring that you're helping with the cyber aspect of that website, and that you're a real person and you're not spamming them. That's fine. But what a lot of people don't realize is that they're also contributing to training the machine learning algorithm. So they're participating in the ongoing refinement of the machine learning algorithm that's running that program. Now, and they never, nobody asked them if they want to do that. They're kind of signed up by default, as it were. And so there are some issues here, which, this whole area of around informed consent, for example, that we talk about. I think this is all getting more and more fleshed out as we go through, and as machine learning is starting to get more and more embedded in our lives and in the way we work. And I think that was the second dimension that we looked at, AI in society, in terms of what it means for how we think about work. And I think there are really important considerations here. It's introducing, and again, as the comment there from the online group participant says, there are different aspects here. On the one hand, there is a positive view that actually AI could really help. It could really take away some of those routine tasks, and that's great. We've seen some very mature examples in areas like invoice coding, for example, where, and the interesting thing is that, this AI tool is not just for the big boys or the big companies. It's used extensively by small and medium practices, for example. The company that provides us has clients mainly in the SMP sector, SME sector. So, things like invoice coding, where, if you want to use a traditional machine product, if you imagine a VLOOKUP in an Excel sheet, if the code, if the thing that you're comparing against is even slightly different, the VLOOKUP will reject it. But machine learning is much more intelligent. It understands the context, and it can understand even if something is worded in a slightly different way, or if something is basically the scan of an invoice. So it's basically unstructured data. It's a scan of an invoice, and AI can be used to convert that into structured data and then to analyze it in a machine learning environment. So these are very clever things that can help with reducing routine tasks. But equally, I think there are also, some areas ethically that need to be thought about. So, for example, how the kind of jobs situation is managed within organizations. It needs to be done in a fair way. There might be some rationalization of workforces, for example, and that needs to be done in a fair and responsible manner. I think there are also questions around, the genuine quality of the work in the background, because, we give an example in the report around this area of labeling of machine learning. This is for classification algorithms in machine learning, where the algorithm learns because somebody in the background has to first tell it. If you take the kind of standard example of, the algorithm, or I'll take the one I gave you, which is the invoice coding one. And the way the algorithm works is somebody has to tell the algorithm in the beginning that this kind of invoice is coded to this kind of code. This kind of invoice is coded to this kind of code. The algorithm doesn't know that. It learns that from the training data. And somebody has to create the training data. And that's often a manual process where somebody basically goes through tons of different things and they're labeled correctly so that the algorithm can learn from the correct information. It's a bit like training, it's teaching a baby, right? You teach a baby good stuff, it does well. You teach it bad stuff, it does badly. So, there's a lot of manual work in the background, which isn't always, and often quite low quality work as well. So, there needs to be a level of transparency as well about what the AI space involves. It's not all just glitz and glamour. There are also issues, I think, around potential, surveillance issues. You can use AI for monitoring remote employees during the pandemic. There's been, a lot of use of it in terms of facial recognition, in terms of, intelligently interpreting keystroke patterns for surveillance. And there's a very important dividing line there between managing productivity and inappropriate surveillance of your workforce, for example. So there are some important issues around integrity, I think, from an ethics point of view, in terms of communicating AI and its impact to employees in a straightforward manner without dressing it up into something which doesn't give the full picture. And I think the third leg of what we talked about around the societal aspect was the consumer side. And, actually, to be honest, and across all these three dimensions, the positive bar was was below 50%. So, less than half of people were positive. And positive is actually the amalgam of, so it was a 5-point standard Likert scale. So very positive, positive, neutral, negative, very negative. So the positive here in these charts is the sum of very positive and positive, and so forth. And no, on none of the three, where there was, kind of on the employer side, on the consumer side, they were both below 50%, and the consumer was the lowest scores actually, in terms of the fact that the negative perceptions were almost as high as the positive, so the net was practically zero. And this was perhaps the most the audience were the most skeptical in terms of the consumer side, in terms of their rights as consumers. And I think there are issues around how data is used. I think that's a big one. And there are issues how data is collected and used. I think there are issues around um, how intrusive the AI can be, because it can learn things about you, and then it might use it in ways that you hadn't intended. There was an example in the report about this very well-known, and it's in the public domain, so it's referenced. Everything in the report is referenced, but how they used, it's an insurance company that used people's videos for facial recognition to try and work out whether they're going to, be a safe bet in terms of their claims, whether they're telling the truth or not. And then they had to backtrack, and they did deny they'd ever done that, and so forth. But it just illustrates what a minefield AI can be from a reputational point of view, from an ethical point of view, if you don't think these things through. And also there are aspects around false marketing. I mean, there is a huge incentive for companies to say that they're offering AI, they're working with AI, when what they might be doing is actually automation rather than AI. So it's a rules-based process that their software is following, rather than a bottom-up machine learning-based process which learns from the data as it comes in, and can change direction if new data takes it in a new direction. So it's fundamentally got a cognitive capability. So there's something here from an ethics point of view around integrity, in terms of transparently representing when AI is being used and not marketing other software. There's something around how the confidentiality of the customer data is respected. I think that's a big part here in terms of the rights of the customer. Um, and then the third leg of the ESG was around governance. And perhaps not surprisingly, we spent quite a bit of time here because it is a vast area, and we've concentrated our comments here in the report on where we saw overlaps to the ethics agenda, and based on what we were seeing in the interviews and the other conversations that we were having. And really, when we sort of boiled it all down, we came to these kind of 2+10 sort of thing, which was basically, there was something around the philosophical dimension and the regulatory dimension, which are slightly more macro, which are almost to do with life and to do with the economy. And then there are 10 things which are very much within the organization, as you're trying to bring in AI in your organization, things that tended to come up quite a bit. And so when we sort of step through all of those things, the first bit around the ethics, is a really, really important one, because one of the things with this space is it's going to throw up new stuff that people haven't seen before. And one of the areas around that is with values. It's to do with what people think is right and wrong. And AI is set to be very much at the sharp end of some of those discussions. If you look back across history, whether it's in medieval Europe or in various parts of the world, you go back 500 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 5,000 years, values evolve. There's a point in time when it was, when you think about the relationship between people and property, for example, there was a point in time when, it was uh, acceptable, to put it bluntly, for a human being to be a slave and a piece of property. There was a point when it was acceptable for a woman to be a piece of property. She was a property of her father before marriage and her husband after marriage. And there are legal systems, if you go back long enough, which recognize this concept. So, human beings and human values are trying to evolve from various points, and we are where we are today. But AI is new, and how we think about it in terms of the distinctions between person and property, for example, are new, and there are new questions coming in. So the point of this from an ethics point of view is that you can't just have a compliance-based checklist. Professional accountants they'll need to accept that they're going to have to use a level of judgment that is which will always sit with them. They're never going to have something which tells them what the answer is, because they're going to often deal with stuff that perhaps hasn't come up before in previous types of software products or in previous types of technologies. I think the second bit, which is on that left-hand corner outside the red boxes, is regulation. And I think regulators around the world are grappling with it, struggling with it, and they're trying to come up with different ways of dealing with it. And I think they're making progress, good progress in many different parts of the world. The EU recently came up with a set of if you like, guidelines, what they're calling a risk-based approach. And at the heart of what the regulatory conundrum, the regulatory challenge is that what you have on the previous slide when you're talking about philosophy is individuals deciding and looking and taking a very customized view on each situation, recognizing that each situation is different. But when you look at it at an organizational level, if you talk to a CFO, what the CFO wants is, can you give me something which I can implement in my organization? Tell me something which I can say that if I do these things, then I'm complying. That's what they want. And so effectively, ethics is trying to balance these two things. One is very individualized and one is something which is scalable. And what the EU risk-based regulatory guidelines is trying to do is bridge these two things to say, we're giving gradations of risk, and we say that we will have this type of regulation for this type of risky AI product. And they define some types of AI product as unacceptable, for example, where they deal with things that create illegal acts. There are some things which they feel are relatively benign, and so they don't need, it's a very light touch regulation. But I think from an ethics point of view, professional standards are going to be really important because this is an evolving space, and accountancy professionals are going to have to stay on top of this stuff as it comes in. And to be honest, it's going to keep changing as well because regulators are working it out. Nobody's got the final answer ready to hand. So, it's good that they're starting to think about it, but professional standards will be a really important part from an ethics point of view for accountants in terms of not getting left behind. I think coming on to the top box on the red box, when you're talking about organizational deployment, I think the first thing to say, which came through very strongly, was tone at the top. So, we can have as much detail as we want about how AI works and all of that good stuff. But really where it really starts is the tone at the top. And, you know, yes, 66% saying that their leaders prioritize ethics as highly as profits is not the highest number, but it is what it is, and I think it's something that we and all interested parties continue to advocate for. I think it's part of the discussion to really make this center stage as an agenda. As you can see, one of those comments there from the participant, the attitude from the CEO is to sell anything remotely close to it, which sounds like AI for as much money as possible. So, that is part of the world of business that we're in. So we have to acknowledge that, and we also have to recognize that not everyone thinks that way. There are lots of people who are very passionate about ethics. There are lots of people, as the second comment shows, who are working in organizations with very enlightened leadership, and I think ultimately ethics is everyone's responsibility. Everyone is a leader in their own way as well. Leadership is not a job title related privilege. Everyone is a leader in their own way, and I think tone at the top reflects in many ways. So diversity, how much does your approach to AI reflect your wider organizational values? For example, diversity and inclusiveness. If you're bringing in AI and you're going to have to fire people, are you thinking about doing this process in a really fair way where things are communicated properly, where the people who are the most vulnerable aren't the people who are suffering as a result of bringing in this new technology in your organization? Are you thinking about these things from a diversity and inclusiveness and fairness point of view? So I think the leadership tone at the top piece is fundamental. I think there's an important critical piece there around AI ethics policy. Many of you might be aware the last couple of years, there's been an absolute flurry of AI ethics frameworks coming through. And rather than creating one more framework, what we've done is we've trawled the marketplace and taken from a range of different best practice frameworks around there. And we found ultimately they all have, many common dimensions. So we've got those 8 there, which are distilled from that. Fairness, which is around avoiding unfair bias, being inclusive. Accountability, so you can't just say, what, the algorithm did it, not my problem. So there's something around human accountability. Sustainability, human-centered AI, thinking about the long-term impact on people and planet. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about the strategic aspects of the ethical consideration. transparency, being clear with customers, for example, where you're using AI, disclosures, how decision is reached. So that's an explainability point, really. Human oversight. I think it's pretty clear that, we are not talking about AGI, which is artificial general intelligence. We're talking about clear human oversight. You might have a view about whether it's, the human is completely in the loop, or the completely controlling every aspect of it, or there's a little bit more agency for the AI. There's a bit of wriggle room and spectrum there, but there is fundamentally a principle of human oversight. There's something around the ethical use of data, particularly around privacy, confidentiality, and considering the needs of the data subjects whose data is being used. That's really important as well, because they are providing the raw material for the AI. There's a piece around safety and robustness, so security and reliability, and resilience of the AI. And then I think there's a principle in the ethics framework around standards and laws, so acting within the legal frameworks and continuing compliance. So, 1 in 5, as you see there from that chart, currently have implemented an ethical framework. So, many of them haven't implemented AI as yet anyway. So I think, but they're starting to get on that journey. And I think hopefully more will get onto it as adoption starts to get more mainstreamed. I think the strategic case for thinking about ethics is also really important, because ethics is about doing the right thing for its own sake, but I think it's really important to also think about it strategically. And I think here, the important thing is to think about long-term value. So it's really important, I think, not to think just in terms of, fear of missing out, or we have a very immediate use case and we can use a bit of AI to solve it, but we haven't really thought about how it fits into what our long-term strategy is as an organization. We took this example, for example, more than half of people, the majority of people, think that AI, the impact on integrity of financial information produced is likely to be positive. Only 3% think it's going to be negative. So they think it's part of the solution. Well, that's fine. But then you've got to think about specific aspects around sourcing, analysis, consolidation of the financial information. Where do you think the AI really fits in terms of the workflow? And being really clear about that. And then once you've identified that, how that fits into your wider kind of view about what your approach to new technology is, and your approach to serving your customers and your employees is. And as you see there, one of the participants, they're using it in creating reports, for example. So they have a very clear understanding. It's cutting the time by 70% compared to pulling financial data manually. That's great. But from an ethics point of view, we think there's really important consideration around fully loaded costs, long-term value. So really understanding what's happening overall when you're working with this particular tool, and what kind of byproduct or unintended factors it might bring in. So there's an objectivity consideration here, not just getting sucked into the immediate problem that you're trying to solve. Oversight and delivery came in quite a bit as well, and this was a big piece actually. And I think one of the things that came up is that AI is a strategic decision. It kind of the reason why we started with tone at the top. So, you can't just have it as an individual project that's buried deep inside a business unit. And that's kind of why job titles and who's leading AI became one of the things that emerged in the discussion if you want to have a really ethical approach to it in your organization. It doesn't matter what the job title is, by the way. People have talked about things like the chief AI officer, and you would have heard other things related to it, like data related roles like chief data officer, data protection officer, so forth. I think personally, I think that what you call it doesn't matter. What matters is clarity on the roles and responsibilities, and the fact that it needs to be a senior executive, ideally C-suite in my view anyway. Because what happens with AI is that you're looking at stuff that can go across organizational silos. You might be using data from lots of different places. You might be using data from external sources, and you need a really joined up view of what you're doing if you really want to get the value from the AI. So it's really important to have that senior level leadership, and also therefore to ensure that top down messaging around ethical adoption of something like this. And in the marketplace, obviously, you would have seen examples where some organizations, a very prominent social media company, has an ethics oversight, famously has an ethics oversight board, which is staffed by non-executives, and they're trying that out, and we'll see how successful that is. But, that's one approach. I think cross-functional teams are really important as well. So in addition to having some, a senior person and giving it that importance, and I think the CFO, by the way, as you can see in that quote there from Karen Smith, a member of ours at IBM. She works in this space. She works with IBM, looking at data governance and AI-related ethics and governance issues. And she's very clear that the accountancy profession has a real role to play. Yes, you talk about the chief AI officer, but it could just as well be the chief financial officer, because they've got all of the skills in their armory to be really making those connections between ethics, business value, process, and that overall control and oversight mindset. So, there's a real opportunity here for the finance professional. And I think cross-functional teams is another big part of this, because you need to have that kind of joined up view between someone who is perhaps more at the end of creating some of these solutions, creating these algorithms, while somebody else might be more at the end of the business side of it and using these algorithms. There needs to be a much more of a cross-functional approach. I think there's also something around, we're seeing organizations, some of them thinking about this a specific role like an AI ethics officer, for example. And I think where you've got complex issues and where you need really specialist view, I think there's potentially a space for that. But I think it's important not to get too sucked in with that, because what we're also hearing is that ethics is, and which we agree with, ethics is, so you've got to manage it on a day-to-day basis. And decisions happen, they're often rapid evolving situations, and you've got to exercise your own judgment. You can't always take everything back to a central officer. There'll be things where that's the right answer, but ethics is everybody's responsibility ultimately. And so I think there's going to be that need for overall kind of a decentralized upskilling in this space across the organization for those who are touching the AI related work that the organization might be doing. Whistleblowing hotlines also came up because some of these things, there are new situations and stuff people may not be aware of, or things may be happening that, someone who's at the senior end, somewhere way back in the top of the organization, isn't finding out about. And whistleblowing hotlines have been suggested as one of the things that are going to be really important here. In fact, there was one, piece of work done looking at, ironically, using AI to receive whistleblower comments, because there was a view that people may be more free about reporting bad practice if they know that it's a chatbot at the other end rather than a human being who might judge them for what they're saying. Now, there are obviously some important ethical considerations there about the ability of a bot to understand the true relevancy and importance of what somebody is saying in a whistleblowing hotline. But I thought it was interesting that that's even being considered. And so I think this whole space of oversight and delivery is going to have ethical issues coming up around professional competence and due care, creating the right kind of oversight and delivery mechanisms. And competence and due care is going to be one of the biggest things across the piece, I think, in terms of fundamental principles that come into play. Because you're dealing with a lot of new things here, and procuring responsibly, which is the next slide there, is another example where competence and due care is going to come into play, we think. I talked a little bit about it at the start when we were talking about the environmental side of it, but it's a much more wider consideration. There's, vendors know a lot more about the AI than, the finance professionals on our side of the fence, if you like, who might be procuring it. And so there's something there around really understanding and not falling for any kind of false marketing. Only 1/3 of respondents are aware of an AI use case in their industry, incidentally. So, which I think that's something which will need to they need to increase their understanding of where it's getting used. I think key partner dependency is also something where if you've got stuck, or if you're using one vendor and if you then want to switch to somebody else, being really clear on what it means for ownership of IP, the data and the model methodology, the parameters and the logic that have been refined using the AI over time because it's training itself. So what does that mean if you want to change vendors, for example? And so, there are competence and due care considerations potentially here. Also, often we find there are pressures on vendors to show quick results for board sign off. Typically the way it works is they get called in to do a proof of concept, and then if it works, then they get the permission to do a bit more. So, vendors have an incentive to try and quickly produce results. And I think accountancy and finance professionals will have to try and balance that and try and make sure that the results are genuine. And where possible, get a third party review of their solutions if that's available to them. In a different report we did, we talked about public procurement and new models for that. And there was a comment there around government policies, and we think that some of that is applicable here, where potentially procurement and e-procurement, that governments can adopt a role here for efficient management of the procurement process, publish reusable data, where there are good vendors who are following good practice, and particularly if they're smaller vendors, it's a way for them to get noticed and to build their credentials. So I think that there are things there to consider even at the public sector level. I think setup and monitoring is fundamental. Documentation sounds relatively boring and basic, but it's incredibly important because we found that that's a key area where ethical issues come up. Is the documentation around the AI model updated? Is it understandable for non-technical audiences? If there are staff changes and handovers, can information be passed on in a reliable manner? Particularly as I talked about cross-functional teams, you'll have people from different parts of an organization. Do they all understand what the documentation is saying? It's not, everyone's not going to be a data scientist. Also maintaining the standard disciplines around maintaining, revising document versions, end-to-end trail. This is proving to be incredibly relevant, and now it's so relevant that there are automated solutions coming up, which kind of automated machine learning documentation solutions to create an end-to-end trail. Because what happens with machine learning is it's constantly iterating, and the model might be evolving and getting changed as it becomes more and more efficient over time. So there are automated solutions for the documentation as well that are springing up, and we think that's also something that people need to be aware of. Access controls, transparency are fairly standard, well-recognized things around things not being hidden behind lengthy contractual jargon that nobody understands. Evaluations are really important as well. We saw, for example, the government of Canada, they've got an algorithmic impact assessment framework. So it's like a survey kind of with 40, 50 questions that look at, how does your algorithm work? What are the things that it's testing for? What are the safeguards that it has? And they've created a kind of algorithmic impact assessment framework effectively. So we think that those kind of things are also going to be part of the solution as we think about operationalizing a lot of this stuff around the governance agenda. And again, competence and due care is going to be really key here to understand what's going on. I think the data agenda is, needless to say, at the heart of AI. AI is fed by data. I think quality, confidentiality were the two big dimensions we looked at. And in fact, it's something that came up a lot in our discussion with IASBA as well. And as we see there, I think about, 50% of people said they're effective, and something like 25% were effective at very effective at confidentiality, and I think about 15 or 16% at data quality. And I think, obviously confidentiality has a compliance angle to it, so it's not surprising the percentages is a little bit higher there. But fundamentally, it's an area that needs to be really thought through very carefully. And as we looked across the data cycle, we saw an interesting trend really for data quality. The biggest challenge was at the front end, data collection. So basically, what people were saying was, if we get good quality data at the front end, it makes our life a lot easier as we try and clean it and improve the quality through the life cycle. I think that's a really big consideration operationally for organizations. And I think for privacy, interestingly, it was more of a bell-shaped, normal-shaped curve, normal distribution, where the biggest issue around the secure storage side of it. So I think that is really, often when data is being actively used, I think the privacy is thought about a lot more. And I think, once it's in storage, it might not be actively used, but actually the privacy considerations are just the same and the obligations are just the same. And I think confidentiality, professional standards from an ethics point of view are going to be really crucial here as well. We also saw some interesting new emerging areas, looking ahead, things like differential privacy, because the whole issue of privacy is because we take a bottom-up view of data. So when we build your AI, the data that feeds it, you have individual records and you know everything about the person in that record. And a lot of that you don't need to know as well. So differential privacy is a new approach that's being thought about in the industry, which is basically saying, can we get the machine learning model to look at insights at an aggregate level and be able to train the model using the aggregate information, what it's telling us statistically? We might need to know that 80% of the data set is behaving in a certain way. We don't need to know what each individual named so and so did, what their individual choice was or their individual profile was. We just need to know that 80% of that data set behaved in a certain way, and we can train the machine learning using that information. So the industry is thinking a lot about that as well. And I think the data agenda is absolutely fundamental. Um, uh, as we look ahead, I'm conscious of time, so I will try and crack on, but I hope I can take a few minutes more. I think the other bit that we looked at was around the model governance, and I think managing bias in the model is a very well recognized, highly discussed aspect. And I think we talked about it from from very much the kind of user perspective. So if you're going to use, for example, we took an example and said if you're going to use AI for recruitment in your organization, for example, you might first of all need to consider if you're providing training data, your training data could be very biased because you've hired a certain kind of person in the past. So one consideration is, even if you're using the AI, your training data that you provide, because the AI is using what you provide to train itself on what kind of people you want to hire in the future. So that's one consideration. Even if you use or you correct for that, or there are ways to account for that and to compensate for that, and you take data which is unbiased in your training data set. But then if you advertise your job in channels which where your brand perception and internal culture and the way you're perceived by the marketplace, only a certain type of person comes to those channels where you advertise your jobs, then effectively your training data might not be biased, but your production data will be biased, your inference data as it's called, because you're only attracting. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there are human issues, organizational issues, and process issues which are nothing to do with AI, but which affect the way the AI performs. And this is also in terms of how you think about bias, which is not obvious. So we saw, for example, things like where if people who are applying seeking part-time work are not making it for a certain type of role, and so the algorithm concludes that people who express an interest in part-time role are not relevant for this job. But actually, people looking for part-time roles, if the data shows that that's highly correlated with being women, then you might be biased in against a protected characteristic like gender, and you might not realize that the AI is really kind of institutionalizing that bias into your organization without you realizing it. So there are some really important considerations here, I think, in terms of how the model is managed. And the model management is a huge area as well. I think we talked a little bit about, I think, the partnering piece with data scientists and understanding their language explainability. I talked a little bit about, what is the model, how does the model arrive at its conclusions. And you can have, it's a big area in itself. You have global and local explainability. So for example, if you give a loan to somebody, right, a housing loan, if you're the CFO of a bank, you might be interested in how the AI model works because you want to build your lending strategy around that. So you're interested in global explainability of the model. But if you're someone who applied for a loan and got rejected and your credit rating was affected, you want to know why your decision was rejected by the AI model. So you're interested in your data point. So there's local explainability. And the AI model has to be able to perform both those functions, not just because it's a nice to have. Actually, they could be regulatory because it's a regulated industry, banking, and there are treat customer fairly obligations in most markets. So explainability is going to be a huge part of it. Model drift is important. You might the model is constantly evolving as new data comes in. And so there are, competence and due care considerations about making sure that you have processes in place to account for that. You can't just procure the system and forget about it. It doesn't work like that. And then distributed delivery is really important, because what we're seeing is, AI is also evolving. There are things like federated learning, where basically, so the traditional way of doing AI machine learning is basically you have a cloud and you have a big model that sits in the cloud and it gets data from everywhere. It sits in the cloud and the model trains in the cloud, so that you can have big models that train properly. And what we're seeing now in new developments, or relatively new, is federated learning, where a lot of the stuff happens at the edge. So it could be people's devices. And what happens is, instead of all the data going to the cloud to the model goes to the edge. And so the model gets trained individually in lots of edge devices, and then gets refined in that way. So there's uh, from a governance point of view, that's a very different thing, and I think there will be organizations that are thinking about that much more. I'm going to close out now with just talking a little bit about system failure resolution and review and feedback. And I think, again, there are ethics issues around integrity and around competence and due care. I think complaints and redress, whistleblowing I talked about earlier, securing the system is really important. And I think around the competence and due care, I just want to close out on two things. One is, I think the training, I think, is really important, and we are thinking about CPD courses that we're running, and things like that to increase people's awareness. And I think lessons learned within organizations is really important. One of the stories that emerged, for example, was an organization that thought that the training of the AI could be done by a junior resource, and what they found was that it needed a fairly experienced mid-level resource to train it, because it required quite a bit of contextual knowledge. So as you learn things, I think that needs to feed into your organizational understanding. So I think, in summary, there's something around setting tone at the top. There's something around delivering sustainable value if you want to have an ethical approach, long-term reputational risk, and I think thinking about SDGs when you think about value. I think professional judgment, you can't just have a checklist-based approach. I think AI, needs to be part of the ESG piece around greenwashing in particular, we found was a big narrative. Complying with regulation and ethics, I think, is going to be really big because it's evolving as well. I think data management will be a big space where ethics plays. Strategic approach, particularly around collaboration across silos, cross-functional teams. So the competence and due care in that respect, and also being able to contest AI decisions is going to be important. You can't just be in a situation where you're forced to accept what the AI says. Understanding the vendor landscape, I think, is going to be an area where there could be ethical risk if that's not handled properly. And building knowledge and skills, as I said, is the other piece where I think, again, there could be ethical compromise if that's not handled properly, both in terms of training and in terms of lessons learned. So I've had a fairly quick canter through, and I hope that provided a bit of a flavor. I'm conscious I've just about run out of time, but let me take a pause there and hand back, if I may, to either Brian or someone else. Brian, perhaps, if I may.
Sounds great, Narayanan. That was excellent. Definitely a canter through, as you said. There's a lot within that report, and thanks so much for providing, kind of bringing some of those highlights together, and then adding just a little bit more color to tie the various pieces to one another. I think that's fantastic. I know we've sort of gone through the hour, but I wouldn't mind if we had an opportunity just for a couple of Q&As here, because it's always beneficial.
Yeah.